Good evening and welcome to the DebtCircle Sundown Brief. I am your host, Leela. Here are today's key updates from the debt markets. Starting with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bonds. Unifin's Capital India Limited recorded a yield of 17.25% with a trade value of 80.00 lakhs. Akara Capital Advisors Private Limited recorded a yield of 15.90% with a trade value of 50.00 lakhs. Akara Capital Advisors Private Limited recorded another yield of 15.50% with a trade value of 15.00 lakhs. Ambium Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 15.00% with a trade value of 0.20 lakhs. Kirtana Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 15.00% with a trade value of 0.04 lakhs. Moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bonds. Fatakpai Digital Private Limited recorded a yield of 16.00% with a trade value of 70.00 lakhs. Fatakpai Digital Private Limited recorded another yield of 16.00% with a trade value of 10.00 lakhs. Hella Infra Market Limited recorded a yield of 16.00% with a trade value of 40.00 lakhs. Apex Homes Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.00% with a trade value of 3,198.00 lakhs. Mapocket Financial Services Private Limited recorded a yield of 13.6973% with a trade value of 100.00 lakhs. Now looking at mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at 27,829.94 crore rupees. Gross sales stood at 31,388.37 crore rupees. Net investments stood at negative 3,558.43 crore rupees. Net investment for June month to date stood at negative 32,404.140 crore rupees. Moving to FPI debt market investment. Gross purchases under general limit stood at 581.31 crore rupees. Under VRR, gross purchases stood at 413.46 crore rupees. Under FAR, gross purchases stood at 1,477.47 crore rupees. Gross sales under general limit stood at 134.16 crore rupees. Under VRR, gross sales stood at 57.16 crore rupees. Under FAR, gross sales stood at 1,198.36 crore rupees. Net investment under general limit stood at 447.15 crore rupees. Under VRR, net investment stood at 356.30 crore rupees. Under FAR, net investment stood at 279.11 crore rupees. Net investment for June month to date under general limit stood at 2,502.98 crore rupees. Under VRR, it stood at 3,090.09 crore rupees. Under FAR, it stood at 10,629.09 crore rupees. Net investment for 2026 year-to-date calendar year under general limit stood at negative 892 crore rupees. Under VRR, it stood at 138 crore rupees. Under FAR, it stood at 25,242 crore rupees. Moving to money market rates. Call rate stood at 5.27%. T-repo stood at 5.13%. Basket repo stood at 5.20%. Special repo stood at 5.08%. Now, India government bond yields. 1-year yield stood at 5.94%. 3-year yield stood at 6.29%. 5-year yield stood at 6.54%. 7-year yield stood at 6.81%. 9-year yield stood at 6.93%, 10-year yield stood at 6.90%, 15-year yield stood at 7.24%, 30-year yield stood at 7.58%. Moving to T-bill yield and auction cutoff. 91-day yield stood at 5.30%, 182-day yield stood at 5.55%, 364-day yield stood at 5.91%. Now, liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at negative 179,446 crore rupees. SDF stood at 179,575 crore rupees. MSF stood at 129 crore rupees. Moving to MIBOR OIS rates. 1 year stood at 6.03%, 2 years stood at 6.21%, 3 years stood at 6.31%, 5 years stood at 6.45%. Now, modified MIFOR rates. 2 years stood at 6.76%, 3 years stood at 6.74%, 4 years stood at 0.00%, 5 years stood at 6.98%. Moving to currency rates. USD by INR stood at 95.78 rupees compared to the previous rate of 95.46 rupees. EUR by INR stood at 110.53 rupees compared to the previous rate of 110.15 rupees. GBP by INR stood at 128.02 rupees compared to the previous rate of 127.74 rupees. JPY by INR stood at 0.60 rupees compared to the previous rate of 0.60 rupees. CNY by INR stood at 14.13 rupees compared to the previous rate of 14.07 rupees. Now, commodities and indices. Gold 24 carat 99.9 purity stood at 14,564 rupees per 10 grams compared to the previous rate of 14,886 rupees per 10 grams. Silver stood at 2,500 rupees per 10 grams compared to the previous rate of 2,500 rupees per 10 grams. Crude oil stood at $91.96 compared to the previous rate of $92.75. Sensex stood at 73,832.55 compared to the previous level of 73,983.18. Nifty stood at 23,161.60 compared to the previous level of 23,214.95. Finally, India primary issuance, corporate bonds. Trust Investment Advisors Private Limited issued 100 crore rupees with a tenure of 109 to 121 months across multiple tranches. The coupon rate is 8.00%. The rating agency is Infomerix Valuation and Rating Private Limited with a rating of AA. Satin Finserv Limited issued 50 crore rupees with a tenure of 25 months. The coupon rate is 10.75%. The rating agency is ICRA Limited with a rating of A-. REC Limited issued 3,000 crore rupees with a tenure of 33 months. The coupon rate is 7.38%. The ratings are provided by Care Ratings Limited, AAA, CRISIL Ratings Limited, AAA, ICRA Limited, AAA, India Ratings and Research Private Limited, AAA. That's all for today's DebtCircle Sundown brief. Thank you for joining me. I am Leela, signing off.